First question is the main point question. So before looking at the answers, you should have a low resolution anticipation of what the main point is. What is the main point in low resolution terms? Well, these three autobiographies and their authors revolutionized the genre of autobiography. They were innovative and they revolutionized. So that's good, but you don't want to hold on too tightly to your low res because you just look at the words here. They're probably going to use higher resolution language, and I don't think you can effectively anticipate or reliably anticipate that language. So just let your low resolution kind of guide you, but ultimately you got to decide between the answers that are given. So A says, certain Latino writers who formerly wrote mostly poetry. What are you talking about? Who are these writers who formerly wrote poetry? Don't tell me it's my writers. My writers are autobiographers. I don't know that they wrote poetry and fiction. So I'm not even sure this is factually accurate. They found their experimentation genres suits her. Okay, yeah, whatever. Latina autobiographers writing in the late 80s set aside some standard conventions in autobiography. They indeed did. Right, in an effort to make the genre more suitable, the genre here, of course, referring to autobiography, in an effort to make the genre of autobiography more suitable for the expression of their personal histories. Yeah, that's pretty good. That sounds like a nice capture of this. So B's good. Let's just pick B. C says, there is a great diversity of styles and narrative strategies among recent traditional and non-traditional Latina autobiographers. I don't know. I didn't read about traditional ones. I read about the ones that were revolutionaries. So yeah, I don't know if this is true. Even within the one that's, if you talk about these three, was there a great diversity of styles? I'm sure that's true. But even if you sort of grant that, you fix this up so that great diversity of styles among recent, let's just fix it up, non-traditional Latina autobiographers. Right, so that's just squarely these three people. Even then, I would say, C, okay, fine, you made a true statement now. Right, it's a true statement, but that's not the main point. Is it a good thing that there's a lot of diversity between them, or is that a bad thing? I don't know. C just states that there is great diversity among them. Do you see that? So it doesn't even start to get at the main point, even after fixing it up and making it true. D says, through recent experimentation in autobiography, Latino writers have shown that nonfiction narrative can be effectively combined with other genres in a single literary work. Okay, that's not their aim, though, right? It's not like, hey, I want to do this. I want to show the world that nonfiction narrative can be effectively combined with other genres in a single work. And let me do it. Let's see, how should I do it? Oh, I know. I'll do it through experimenting with autobiography. Done. I did it. Success. Right? That's really weird. No, they didn't want it. They just wanted to write an autobiography. And then they realized, well, the existing structure's autobiography doesn't really allow me to tell my story. So yeah, I'm going to just blow up the existing structures, redraw these boundaries so that they'll contain my stories. Do you see, D has even though I feel like D is kind of true, right? You can say that, yeah, there was some experimentation with autobiography, and through that, they did manage to show that nonfiction narrative, like, for example, autobiography is nonfiction narrative, can be effectively combined with poetry, say, in a single literary work. Yes, true. I think these authors succeeded at doing that. But the way that D is stated is not the main point, as I hopefully illustrated just now. Okay, so E says, recent writings by Latina authors have prompted some literary critics who specialize in autobiography to acknowledge the differences in gender and ethnicity. What are you talking about? The only critic that we mentioned, it was like this critic over here. That was such a minor point. In fact, I think we can delete this whole sentence without really losing a lot in the passage. So to make that the focal point of a main point question, that can't be right. Even if this is true, it's missing the point. Plus, I don't think it's true. There's no sense in which it's often. Right? Sure, like maybe it happens once, or it happened once. I don't know that it's often. Question 2 says, according to the passage, so I already know that the answer is likely going to be explicitly stated, or at least closer to that end of the spectrum than strongly implied, because it says according to the passage. Now, which one of the following was a motivating factor in certain Latina authors' decision regarding the structure of their autobiographical writing? Well, we talked about 3 authors, or I guess 4, but this mother-daughter pair I'm going to count as 1. So we talked about, let's say, with 3 authors, motivating factor. So, whatever answer choice you choose, the support has to come from, I think, the second paragraph, And so A says the importance of chronological ordering to those authors' artistic goals. Well, no, chronological ordering was rather unimportant. I think A might be attractive if you kind of realize that, hey, Moraga's Loving in the War Years was not chronologically organized. In fact, it was chronologically disorganized, where deference was given to arrangement in terms of her political development. Okay, so you might be thinking, oh yeah, that's right. So it was important. Chronology was important to her, just in the negative way. Yeah, okay, that's fair, right? I think that's fair. I think she was quite conscious of chronology and how she would sacrifice chronology so that you could arrange it through political. But that's not what A is saying. Do you see? There's a big difference there. The question Sam is asking, what was a motivating factor in, well, if you're going to pick A, you're thinking of Moraga. Right, so what was a motivating factor in Moraga's decision regarding the structure of, you can say politics, right? That's right. Arrangement and political development, you would have textual support. But the importance of chronological ordering, well, that wasn't important, right? You see, it wasn't important. That's why you can't pick it. Now later, not that this matters, but the critic says, hey, chronological ordering is important for men. Okay. B says, those authors stated intention of avoiding certain non-narrative. What are you talking? When did they state their intention of avoiding non-narrative genres? So to avoid non-narrative genres, meaning you're only going to engage with narrative genres. You're just made up, right? Like it's nowhere here. C says those authors' preference to avoid overt political. No, because right here. So it kind of goes against the text. D says the complexities of identity formation faced by those authors. Now, D is very well supported, even if you didn't quite understand what this last sentence in the second paragraph was saying, which I completely get. It's a really tough sentence to understand, and I'm not sure I understand. I just kind of made a pass at it. But even if you don't understand it, I think you can be like the complexities of identity formation. Right? It says right here, the writers employ this and that, these literary forms to express the complexities inherent in the formation of their identity. So yes, you can say the complexities of their identity formation motivated them in terms of the structure of their autobiographies, because the sentence seems to support it very well, even though you might not quite understand what that means. So this is another instance. This happens a lot on the LSAT. Sometimes questions are really hard and you truly just have to understand something in order to get the right answer, but not always. And that's the thing. Like sometimes they're able to mask a thing in difficulty, which is there. It's difficult. But you know what? You actually don't need to penetrate that difficulty to get the right answer choice. Okay, so you want to be mindful of those kind of situations like that exist. So that you might be able to grab points that on the surface seem like they're lost to you. Okay, so here's an example of that. Lastly, he says, those authors' judgment that poetry should not be a narrative medium, just, again, totally made up nonsense. Where did the author judge that poetry should not be a narrative medium? Question 3 says the author's discussion of getting home alive serves primarily to do what? So this is a function or purpose of a phrase, idea in context. And you can tell because it says serves primarily. Like, what is the primary purpose? Now, the key for this kind of question is you have to remember it has to be in context. I know it's like they never say it's in context because in some sense it's redundant. Of course, it's like serves primarily in context. Obviously, you don't need to say that. Yeah, but I kind of do need to say that because I think if we don't say it, and the question stems never do, you kind of forget it. You don't remember that. You don't it's not emphasized, right? So you really have to consider this in context. Now, in context really should call to mind your low resolution summaries, which is the first thing you should turn to for these function purpose questions. Perfect. It's exactly what our low resolution is prepared for. It's an example. Example of what? Example of the kind of innovation that they talked about in the previous paragraph. So there, armed with your low resolution summary, I think you're already down to answer choices A and E. Okay, then from this point, it just takes a little bit of distinction to realize which one is right and which one is wrong. So let's look at A first. It's to distinguish one type of experimental autobiography from the other two types by the Latina writers. So we're saying the reason why we mention Getting Home Alive, it's to distinguish it from Loving in the War Years and Borderlands. Well, to some extent that might be right. It certainly is a different book. And even in presenting it as example 1, example 2, example 3, there's some implicit sense of distinguishing. Sure, but it does not rise up to the level of answer choice A. Okay, because look at what it's saying here. Getting Home Alive departs even further from what? Not from these two, but rather departs further from the conventions typical of autobiography. That's what it's departing further from. Okay, meaning these two also depart. It's like if this is the convention of autobiography, and this is like as far out as you can get from it. It's like maybe Borderlands is here, Borderlands lands here, and Loving lands here, and then Getting Home lands here. So you see, all three of them depart from the conventions. Just Getting Home departs the most. So A is saying distinguish one type from the other two types, meaning it's not just a quantitative difference, which is all the author is trying to say. It's just a quantitative difference. This one just goes out further. A is trying to say that it's a qualitative difference. It's actually a different type. This is totally different from these two. No, sorry, just no. And E has it right. E says to illustrate the extent of certain Latina autobiographers' experimentation, form, and structure. See, I just showed you with these two, they are experimenting, but let me show you really how far out they can get. Right? Getting Home Alive goes really far out. It departs even further from the conventions. That's why E is the correct answer choice. Now, the others, I think, if you were drawn to any of the others, I have to admonish you to pay more attention to your low resolution summaries. Okay, because really if you don't, like any of them could have been the right answer choice. Minus the context, any of them, D could have been right to show why readers have difficulty understanding certain autobiographies by Latina writers. The author really could have, and it was mentioned, over here. While this order may seem fragmentary and confusing, so the author is fully aware that it could be confusing. But is that why the author talks about this? No, absolutely not. You just have to imagine a totally different kind of passage where the author's like, man, those Latina writers, who the hell knows what they're talking about? So confusing with their mix of narrative poems and blah, blah, blah. You don't believe me? Let me show you an example. Look at this book, Getting Home Alive. What is this? Like one person writes and another person writes and another person writes right after. They don't even tell you when one person stops talking, the next starts talking, blah, 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 blah. Right? Don't you see how confusing it is? You see, that's what would be like. That would be if talking about this was the primary purpose, to show that, it could be difficult. That's wrong. That's not even close to the primary purpose. This is just sort of some like random little side point. I was like, listen, I know it might be confusing, but trust me, it's fully intentional and it's carefully designed, right? An experiment with literature. So you see, D is, but you can see what I mean. Like if you just change up the passage, well then yeah, D could be the right answer choice because you changed the context. Okay, and same with C. It could have been to demonstrate that the use of multiple voices is a common feature of Latina autobiography. I mean, certainly it's used here. There's two voices. The author's thesis main point could have been, look, using multiple voices, totally common in Latino autobiography. You don't believe me, right? Of course you don't believe me. Let me prove it to you. Consider example number 1, Getting Home Alive. Now consider example number 2, something else. Now consider example number 3. See, in all 3 books, there are multiple voices. So don't you believe me now that it's actually a common feature? I mean, you can imagine a passage like that, but that would be a passage in our imagination. It wouldn't be this passage. So in this context, Getting Home Alive is not used in this way. And it's the same with B. B, I think, is probably explain how they combine journal entries and poems in their works. Here, I'm not actually quite too sure that they even had journal entries, but yeah, I don't even think that's true. So probably easier to get rid of. Question 4 says the passage indicates which one of the following about the Latina autobiographies that the author discusses. So once again, the question stem's wording leads me to think that the answer choice will be explicitly stated, at least closer to the explicitly stated end of the spectrum than Strawling implied. And, the autobiographies, once again, were in the meat of it, which is the third paragraph, the longest paragraph, because that's where we talk about each autobiography. So let's take a look. Each here refers to each autobiography. Okay, so each one, Borderlands, Loving the War Years, and Getting Home Alive, contains some material that would ordinarily be regarded as belonging to a genre of literature other than autobiography. Yeah, that's right. I mean, a big point was made about that, about how they're multi-generic. They mix genres, and that was one of the innovations. Like here in Borderlands, So like you got narrative sequence and poetry. That's totally a different genre. That was mentioned even in the first paragraph where we were introduced to the proliferation of poetry, and then we're like, oh, hey, but a different genre came up too, autobiography. So these two are not the same genre. So that's the support for, right here is the support for the first one, but we have to do it for each of them. The second one, Loving the Warriors, says it's likewise characterized by mixed genres. So once again, it's supported. And lastly, Getting Home Alive contains, right here, narratives and poems again. Okay, this is all poems. Because I didn't realize that. But anyway, it's apparently it's all poems. Okay, so yes, this is correct. It was indicated that this is true. Each one quotes from previously unpublished private journals. No, I don't like. Did they mention? I know they didn't mention journals for this last one because we just read that, right, for the previous question. The journals were mentioned kind of, over here along with the essays and the sketches and the short stories. I don't think sketches were mentioned either. Like also sketches, like pictures, right? Like that you sketch out something like a drawing. So yeah, anyway, that's not mentioned. C says each contains analysis of the ways in which its content was influenced by its author's cultural background. This is a really tricky answer choice. Here it's the each, of course, refers to the autobiographies. I think probably the best way to think about C is that there's a big difference between autobiographies and literary criticism. On the one hand, you have autobiographies, and on the other hand, you have literary criticism. Autobiographies take for their subject a person's life. Literary criticism takes for its subject, well, a book, like an autobiography, for example. So this is meta-analysis. This is like literary criticism takes this thing as the subject, whereas this thing takes this thing as the subject. Okay, so C is kind of going for that. C is trying to get you to confuse what we're talking about, which is autobiographies with literary criticism. You know who analyzes the ways in which content influenced by author's cultural background? Our author does. Our author in this passage 1 from section 3 of PT 65. Our author does this analysis of the ways in which, well, not its contents anymore. You have to say the contents of the autobiographies written by the authors, how the author's cultural background influenced their writing, right? Because right here, I mean, at least with Getting Home Alive, right, I think the author made a pretty good case, good analysis that it definitely, the author's, the mother and daughter's background influenced. So to encounter an autobiography that did this, right, to be like, oh, each of these autobiographies did it, that would be really bizarre. Like you're reading the autobiography, Loving the Warriors, okay, you flip, you find a poem, it's like, oh, that's kind of odd, right? But I get it. And then you flip to the next page, and it becomes a meta-analysis of itself, right? The author's like, I know I'm writing an autobiography. Let me take off my autobiographer hat for a second. Let me pop on my literary criticism hat, and let me analyze for you what I just wrote, the previous 100 pages, and let me show you how the previous 100 pages was influenced by my cultural background. That's trippy, okay? That's like really, I mean, I'm not saying that wouldn't work, but it's certainly not something that, it's not something that we know happened in these 3 books. And D says each contains writings that were produced by more than one author. See, this is just not, I mean, you can say one of them did, right? For sure, like this one did, but you can't say each of them did. And lastly, E is very similar to C in that it sounds more like something like the explanations of the methodologies an author used. Again, sounds something like you'd find in literary criticism as opposed to in an autobiography. Question 5 says, based on the passage, the author's attitude towards getting home alive can most accurately. So just again, low resolution anticipation, like positive attitude or negative attitude. Of course, positive attitude. So on that alone, you can get rid of, well, just one answer choice, which is unfortunate. But you never know. Sometimes, they make the questions really easy. So they give you 3 answer choices that are all like super negative, whereas clearly it's a positive attitude. And then you really just have to decide between 2 positives. So, if that happens, take it. Right here, clearly it didn't happen. They really only gave us disappointment in scholars' failure to recognize. No, come on. Like our author is very positive about it. So the rest of these are all sort of kind of positive, but let's take a look. Expectation that readers in general might not readily recognize that there's a clear purpose for its unconventional organization. So some of you, this probably just jumped out because you remember our author cautioning the reader, saying, look, while the ordering may seem fragmentary and even confusing, I promise you it's fully intentional and a carefully designed experiment with literary structure. So you see, the author expects that some readers, or here readers in general, might not readily recognize that there's a clear purpose, might be confused by the unconventional organization. So B is really good. Now, I think B is kind of well hidden because it's like, this is really kind of a tangential point, or not really the main idea of talking about getting home alive. The main point of talking about getting home alive is how it was revolutionary. So I can see why that might be a cloak for B. That kind of hides B. But nonetheless, here is the line support for answer choice B. C says, surprise that academic commentators have treated it as having significance as a historical document. Now, see, this is, you fully read this answer choice, and then you realize, oh, actually, this is not so. The implication here is that our author expected commentators to treat it as not having significance. Right? So when the academic commentators treated it as having significance, our author's like, oh, really? You think seriously, this book is significant? Right? I mean, come on, that's kind of weird. I don't think the author would do it. The author would be like, yeah, about time you recognize this book is significant. Right? Because it is significant. So that's why C is also, I think it's just not as obvious. Like where you see disappointment, failure, I think on that low res pass, that low res analysis, you just immediately get rid of it. Whereas surprise is like, well, depending on what you're surprised about. Right? So once we figure out what they're surprised about, then it's like, yeah, okay, no. Our author wouldn't be surprised about this. And then we have confidence, right? Confidence sounds good, it's positive. Confidence that it will be widely recognized by scholars as a work of both both history and literary criticism. Well, no, that's just not. Our author has good feelings about this book. Our author clearly appreciates the book, but does that mean our author feels confident that it will be widely recognized? Absolutely not. That is a huge non sequitur. Think about all the things that you have good feelings about, things that you think are valuable and worthy. Does that mean you have confidence that everyone will recognize it? You might hope that's the case. Think about your favorite TV show. Let's say it's not so popular, right? You think it's valuable, you think it's very well done, but it's for whatever reason it's not popular. Now, are you confident that it will be widely recognized? Right? I mean, you shouldn't be. It could be widely recognized, but there's no sense in which, really nothing here betrays that our author is confident that it will be. And lastly, he says insistence that it should be credited with having helped to broaden the critic's understanding of what counts out. Yeah, this one also kind of maybe about sounds a little right, but there are lots of issues with it. First of all, if you want to say that something has merit, it's kind of like the totality of the three autobiographies that has merit, not really just this one that has merit. And then you have to be very careful about merit for what. It should be credited with having helped to broaden the boundaries of autobiography. You can say that because that's true, because that's down over here. Revolutionized genre, redrew the boundaries of. But wait, that's not what E is saying. E is saying that it helped to broaden the critics' understanding of autobiography. Who knows what the critics understood or didn't understand? Maybe you can't just assume that the critics were looking at this and was like, what is this? I don't understand what I'm looking at. Maybe the critics already knew this was autobiography and was just waiting. Like the critics was waiting. Finally, someone came along and actually wrote an autobiography that wasn't so restricted. Do you see? So it's just not supported. Question 6 says the author most likely intends to include which one of the following principles among the, quote, existing generic parameters. And that's line 51. Okay, that's right over here, existing generic parameters. So this is a meaning of a phrase in context question. Okay, meaning of a phrase in context. Let's take a look at the phrase here in the context. The phrase is existing generic parameters, and our author is saying, look, these autobiographers, did not force their personal stories jam them into these existing generic parameters. Rather what they did was they redrew the parameters. They pushed out the parameters. Okay, so these must be like just conventional things, right? These conventions typical of autobiographies that if you can show me one of these conventions typical of autobiography, then I'm going to pick it. Okay, so the events presented in autobiography should be arranged sequentially according to when they actually happen. Yeah, that sounds really good. That's just the convention of chronology, where this second book departed from the chronological convention by organizing events according to political development, which, by the way, I still don't know what this means. But you see, you can get away with this kind of stuff. It turns out not to matter, right? But anyway, so A is good. B says, when different modes of presentation are combined in one literary work, no one mode should be given a preference. What are you talking about? That is not a convention. That's not existing. It's not like back in the standard version of autobiography, they already allowed multiple modes of presentation. It's like, but we always, like we as in our standard square autobiography, always allowed poetry in and short stories and sketches. It's just, we really just wanted to insist that you don't have one mode overpowering, domineering another mode, right? And these Latino authors came along, it's like, no, I'm going to have my poetry completely dominate the sketches, right? And this one's like, no, I'm going to have my narrative dominate my short stories. Like, what? Like, no, that's not what happened. C says, autobiographical writing should not have political overtones. No. I mean, we know that at least one of these autobiographies had political overtones, but it's not the fact that it had political overtones that was so innovative. It's the fact that it wasn't arranged chronologically. Rather, the arrangement was in terms of her political development. That was what was innovative. Not that it had political overtones. So that's probably what C is trying to do, trying to get trap you into thinking that Loving in the War Years was political, and that's what was innovative. No, probably other autobiographies were political as well. D says sketches and poems collected together in a single work need not be separated by genre within that work. D is similar to B in that it's pretending like the old square autobiographies were way hipper than they actually were. Right? Again, I just have to give the same explanation for D that I did for B, which is that, are you sure that the old autobiographies even allowed poems and sketches in? I don't think so, because that was what was so innovative. So don't pretend like you're cool. We all know you're square. And E says, personal experiences can be represented in a compelling way in any literary genre. I don't even know. So now apparently autobiography is not even autobiography. It's some principle of literary criticism, right? You can write about your personal experience in any genre, using poems, using short stories, using autobiography. How weird is that? Like, why would the parameters of the genre of autobiography be concerned with what happens in poetry? Yeah, it makes no sense. And last question, 7. It's a big one, as you can see. It's a weakening question. We are asked to undermine the author's claim in lines 50 through 55. That is to say, this claim here about the effect Latina autobiographies discussed had on the genre of autobiography. Yeah, what's the effect here? Let's just read it again to remind ourselves. Rather than forcing these writers, or they revolutionized the genre autobiography. They revolutionized it. They redrew the boundaries to make it more amenable to expression. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there's like decent support for this. You can find it in the entire passage in the previous paragraphs. Now, our job is to undermine that. Like, yeah, all this stuff is true, but the fact that all this stuff is true now no longer supports your conclusion that they revolutionized and they redrew the boundaries. All right? Few autobiographical works published after 1985 have been recognized for their effective use of chronologically linear prose as a means of portraying the complexities of membership in multiple cultures. What? Okay, so we're talking about autobiographical works published after 1985. Right? Not all of them, but rather just a subset of those autobiographical works published after 1985 that have been recognized for what? For effectively using chronologically linear prose as a means of portraying complexities of membership in multiple cultures. Wow. Okay, so like 7 of them have, 7 of them got awards. Okay, what is that supposed to, how does that relate to this? These Latina authors aren't saying you cannot use chronologically linear prose, right? It's just like, hey, you don't have to. You don't have to. You can do something else. So the fact that few of them that use chronologically linear prose and like did something, wrote and they were recognized, right? They've been recognized. Okay, great, good for you. Right? This has no bearing on this argument. Few critically acclaimed books written by Latina authors have been autobiographical collections consisting partly or wholly of essays, poems, short stories, sketches, and journal entries. Okay, so again, like, by the way, I sort of implicitly did it with answer choice A, but let's do this explicitly with answer choice B, just to find exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about books written by Latina authors. Okay, start with that set. Books written by Latina authors. Then they're saying we're taking the subset of that. We're not looking at the novels. We're not looking at the nonfiction. We're looking at the we're only looking at a subset of nonfiction. We're looking at the autobiography. So you have to take a subset, autobiography, And then we can't look at all the autobiography. We have to look at a subset of that, which is the subset that consists partly or wholly of essays, poems, short stories, sketches, and journal entries. So in other words, stories that look like what they wrote, right? What these three Latina authors wrote. So we're looking at a further subset. And then we got to look at the critically acclaimed ones, not all of this subset, but the critically acclaimed ones. So we're getting to a pretty small subset here. And we're basically saying, yeah, few of them. There's like, this is not a large number. This is a few number. The subset that I just described is a small number. Most, in fact, are not. Okay. Again, like, what am I supposed to make of this? I know what B is kind of trying to get me to think. It's trying to get me to think that, oh, so you think these three Latina authors are so great, they're so revolutionary, they redrew the boundaries. Well, then how come no one wrote books like the ones they wrote after this? First of all, I don't know when this is happening, okay? There's no timestamp on this. It could just be that you just wait longer, and then you'll get a whole flood of books that are trying to emulate them. Second of all, it doesn't even matter that there's no timestamp given, because why do we even care about copycats? Right, like people who would copy the style and the sort of mixing of genres and whatever. Like, is that supposed to be some indication that they in fact revolutionize? How do you know that maybe the next generation of Latina autobiographers they looked at these three works, realized that they pushed the boundaries of what could be an autobiography. They decided to push it even more, which is why their work, the next generation, looks nothing like the previous generation. But certainly, the previous generation had a huge impact. It's what opened the next generation's eyes. It's what allowed the next generation to even know where forward is to push. Do you see? So I don't even need a timestamp. The few here it does nothing, right? Okay, fine. So 7 of them were acclaimed. Big deal. And C is very similar to A. It says many autobiographies have been written by authors unified, it's not like once they did this, nobody can write unified chronologically linear prose anymore. That's not the point. Okay, so C and A are similar in that respect. They're irrelevant for the argument because the argument never pretends that nobody can write unified chronologically linear prose anymore. D says several 19th century autobiographies that are generally unknown among contemporary critics of 20th century autobiography are characterized by generically mixed structure and multiple authorship. This is such a well-hidden answer choice. First of all, I got to point out these two like completely nonsensical dating schemes. Like, why is it that the 1800s is called the 19th century? It makes no sense, right? Like, 1900th century is referring to the 1800s, whereas the 20th century is referring to the 1900s. So what they're actually saying here is that in the 1800s, already there were autobiographies. And let's just skip all this bit. Okay, this is just interjected, right? Right, it's additional description of this. Right, so there's an additional difficulty of the grammar being hard for answer choice D. But let's focus just on this, okay? Now remember, we're talking about 3 works that were written in the 80s, in the late 80s, in the 1900s. In other words, towards the tail end of the 20th century. And now answer choice D is telling us, hey, you know what? 100 years ago, at least 100 years ago, what about these 1800s autobiographies? Well, here's the predicate. They are characterized by generically mixed structure and multiple authorships. Oh, so wait, you guys are just late to the game. This has already been happening for 100 years and you are just now adopting it. Well, sorry, I got to take your revolutionary hat back, right? You don't get a badge anymore. You see, that's how D is working. So if you've done, and this is a spoiler alert for a previous PT about a sculptor, Japanese-American sculptor Noguchi, you'll remember in that passage set, there was a question, also a weakening question about our author's argument. And it's the very same answer choice about why Noguchi wasn't so revolutionary. And the correct answer was maybe he learned it from Brancusi, for whom he worked for a while, right? Someone else beat him to it, in other words. It's the same answer here. Someone else beat them to it, right? Okay, so now I skipped over all this stuff. By the way, this is already why D is right. I skipped over all this modifier, mainly because it makes the sentence easier to understand. But we're not getting a complete understanding of the sentence because there's more information in the sentence. So let's get that complete picture. They're saying something else about these autobiographies that are written in the 1800s, in the 19th century. They're saying they're obscure. Just generally speaking, contemporary critics of 20th century autobiography, like, for example, like whom? Like our author, maybe, right? Like an author is a contemporary critic of 20th century autobiography. Our author very well may not know about their existence. So do you see why our author makes this argument that, hey, they're so revolutionary? Answer choice D is like, oh, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but you're just ignorant on some point, okay? It's not your fault. You just, I don't know, maybe it's your fault. But there were people writing stuff like this 100 years ago, okay? They're not the first ones to the game, right? And it's kind of obscure. Most people don't know about it. It looks like you also don't know about it. Now the author's like, well, crap. I guess my argument's kaput. Okay, so D is super effective in undermining the author's argument. And lastly, E says several multi-generic non-autobiographical collections. Wait, non-autobiographical collections. Okay, so not autobiographies, consisting at least partly of poetry, blah, 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 have been published, and many of them have been critically. That's fine. What does that have to do with anything? You're not an autobiography. Oh, but you know what you are? Right? You are also multi-generic, right? In what sense? In the sense that you're partly poetry, partly short stories, partly essays, and you're also written by Latina authors, and it's also after 1985, and you've also been critically acclaimed. Well, that's great. Good for you. What does that have to do with this? Let's now go back to the autobiography world. There's still revolutionaries in the autobiography world, right? So E doesn't work.